Welcome to All the Best, an interview series with UNL ORCA awardees, where UNL means University of Nebraska Lincoln, and ORCA is the Outstanding Research and Creativities Award, which is UNL's top award. In Gerda Lerner's book, Why History Matters, she explains the life stories give meaning to the present and the future because we identify what is important to us. And she says, our stories show how we are interconnected in a particular time and place. As for this interview series, ORCA awardees have experiences that reach back more than a half a century, which will give us a personal view of how the best research emerged from UNL. It is my pleasure to introduce today's interviewee, Professor Paul Olson. He was awarded the ORCA in 1984. After I provide a quick summary of his life and career, Paul will tell us about his time at UNL, starting with his award-winning research. Paul was born in 1932 in Washburn, Wisconsin. During his youth, his family also farmed in Nebraska and South Dakota. He earned a bachelor's degree from Bethany College in Lindsborg, Kansas. Next, he earned a master's in English from the University of Nebraska, then had a Fulbright fellowship to spend a year at London University in England, and finally, he got his doctorate in medieval and Renaissance studies from Princeton University in New Jersey. In 1957, he joined UNL as an instructor, quickly became an assistant professor, and rose through the ranks. One of his earliest projects was to help English teachers across the state to reform their curricula. As a literary historian, he eventually published 12 books and many book chapters and articles on topics such as medieval literature, Plains and Indian literature, and English education reform. In 1976, he became the founding director of the Center for Great Plains Studies, which is now celebrating its 50th anniversary. Paul retired in 2006 and still lives in Lincoln, Nebraska. With that, I'd like to welcome Paul to the interview. We're going to start out with a question about the campus when you first saw it for the first time.
So, yeah, well, I was a summer school student here in 1950.
Okay.
And I took a master's degree in 1951 to 53, and I returned it with a doctorate from Princeton in 1957. The campus was essentially the area from Morrill Hall over to the administration building, without the administration building, and the student union, and the library, and then a number of older buildings that have since been torn down, reaching over to the Law College building now, and the building's stadium. That's sort of the circumference. It was a very, to my mind, a very ugly campus because there was so much construction going on. From 1950 to 1965, there was a lot of building going on because the enrollment went from about 4,500 to 25,000 or 20,000 in those years, and there were big piles of dirt. When I first came, there was a ghetto education of the campus, which was caused by the university. The university was buying that land and not fixing up the houses, renting the houses to Black Americans. So the surroundings of the campus were rather ugly. And then on, I guess it was 14th Street. That's the street that goes past the administration building, or that used to go past the present administration building. And there was a business district still, and a drugstore and several shops. And the student union had only the old part of the student union. The library did not have the addition to it. But I remember I went to a meeting of the faculty with Hardin, and I in 1957 when I first came, and I said, well, he was talking about university expansion plans and how wonderful it would be. And I said, well, with this university expansion, why do you have to make the campus so ugly? And Lindsborg Smith, who was then the dean of architecture, said, "Well, I've been the champion of the beauty of the campus for 40 years or whatever. And it's the most beautiful campus in the nation. And this has been my whole career to make this place beautiful." And I thought, well, I didn't say it, but your career has failed, I thought. And so that's what the campus looks like.
Okay.
Very unpleasant.
Let's jump into your award-winning research for the ORCA. And I don't know if you know exactly why you got the ORCA, but I know you know the timing. And give us a sense about how it came about that you got the ORCA, what you did, and why it's important.
Well, I had by that time I had about $10 million in research money.
Oh, okay.
So that was almost, I think it was the second most in the United States in the humanities.
Oh, wow.
And I had a lot of graduate students, and eventually I had probably had about 35, 40 graduate students by that time. I had eventually had 70. And I had published a fair amount on Shakespeare and Chaucer that was pretty well received. Some of it was controversial, which was fine. I don't know, somebody decided to nominate me and I got the award. I didn't particularly seek it, and I was a little surprised to get it because in the humanities, books are more important than articles, at least they were regarded so at that time. And my Princeton book was being read, the one that the Princeton University Press published was being read at the time that I got the ORCA award. It was published eventually, and I got the award. So,
okay.
That's what I know.
So then why did you have $10 million of grants? What were they for?
Well, they were for research in Chaucer and Shakespeare and educational reform, and eventually for I was the first director of the Great Plains Center, and I wrote the proposal for that. And I wrote proposals for a U.S. Office of Education Commission on Undergraduate Education.
Oh.
So it was a variety. I did research on Native Americans and Chaucer and Shakespeare and educational reform, and it was those three areas.
Okay. So tell us then about Shakespeare and Chaucer. What did you actually say about them?
Well, that's a little hard to say in one sense. Chaucer, I was interested in Chaucer's role at the court of Richard II. He was a court poet. And also a member of Parliament, and I was interested in the theory of the good society that Chaucer developed and how he represented it in his various works in the Canterbury Tales. And so I wrote a book called The Canterbury Tales and the Good Society. And Shakespeare, I published in 1950. I published a lot of articles on Chaucer before I published my book. On Shakespeare, I published in 1957. I published an article on Midsummer Night's Dream that it was well received, particularly by British scholars. The Oxford Chief Shakespeare Scholar said it was probably the best essay on Shakespeare he'd ever read. Well, that's not true, but I'd worked hard on it. I had published it as a graduate student. And I did a lot of work on Shakespearean iconology. And I was among the earliest scholars to do that. And later I published Midsummer Night's Dream as a Shakespearean comedy, as you know. And later I published a book on Shakespeare and his comedies. And I taught Shakespearean comedy for 35, 40 years. And
So tell me about some of the iconography, the images or the images that he uses.
Well, there's in a Midsummer Night. I'll take a Midsummer Night's Dream. In Midsummer Night's Dream, there's a Bottom is a weaver, one of the low life characters in the play, and he becomes somewhat infatuated with Titania, who's the queen of the fairies. And in his infatuation, the spirit of Oberon's helper, Puck, brings in an animal head to put it on Bottom, which is what happens in classical mythology to people that are overcome by erotic love and become animals.
Oh.
And I showed him how that worked. I mean, I showed a lot of other iconography.
Sure. Oh, that's a good one.
Anyway, I tried to interpret the whole play through traditions of symbolism and iconology, and it worked pretty well.
So then about English reform, I believe you started that after you became a professor. You'd been a professor a few years. How did that all come about?
No, I hadn't been a professor a few years when I started on English reform. I started that work in 1961.
Oh.
And I don't know when I became a professor, 62 or 63. I became a chaired professor in 1968, I believe. But when I came, my mother was a one-room school teacher, and I knew that Nebraska education was pretty poor in the 50s. I had gone to schools here in Nebraska in the 50s, rural one-room schools and also other schools. And I'd had dealings with the State Department of Education. It was a pretty mediocre department at that time. And when I was at Princeton, I decided I would come home to Nebraska because that was my roots. And if I had a chance, I would try to do something about educational reform in the state. My mother was still teaching, and I had a lot of friends who were school teachers. And I felt bad that Nebraska children who were very bright and very well balanced were receiving such paltry educations. So sometime in the early 60s, Jim Miller, who was my chair at the time, he later went on to the University of Chicago, said that there was going to be a large educational effort to reform education that would be conducted through the U.S. Office of Education and Bureau of Research. And he thought I would be a good person to try to get some research money. So I wrote a grant, and I got a grant from the Woods in 1961. In 1962, I got a $250,000 grant to start that reform, which lasted for 5 years. And we produced a curriculum that was helpful. It's not used much anymore, but it influenced virtually all the curricula that are being used in the country.
And so how did you get the word out? How did you find the teachers to interact with?
Oh, well, we knew some good teachers around the state. There were some very bright teachers who had, and then we advertised it. So we sent out a note to all the schools in Nebraska and had a form that we asked them to fill out. And, and then we had training sessions every summer where we trained them, and they helped to write the curriculum. And they formed a kind of community of teachers that not only wrote much of the curriculum, but were its guardian, so to speak, to make sure that it was done properly. And then the State Department endorsed it, and they didn't require it, but they endorsed it. And so we have influenced a lot of other curricula: Hawaii, Oregon, Virginia Beach, Virginia, places like that adopted it or wrote their own versions of it. That's one thing we did. We never did put it in copyright. We told the schools that if they wanted to use it and write their own versions or their own modifications, we would welcome that. And so I didn't make any money on it. The other curriculum development centers all put their curricula into copyright and tried to make money on them. I don't think they made any money anyway. In fact, that we had left it without a copyright. And we also had some different things in there. We included elementary school teachers in it, and that had not been done by any of the other centers. Oh. And so English work in the elementary schools was very, very bad, very mediocre, and didn't include much attention to literature at the time. And the attention to grammar was an outmoded form of grammar. So we tried to invent a curriculum that did a good job of teaching first-rate children's literature and a modernized form of grammar, and encouraged a lot of writing on the part of kids. And that worked out well.
I know, that sounds really wonderful. How many teachers would come to the workshops in the summer?
Well, I think we'd have about 25, 30.
Okay.
And that meant that for several years I wasn't able to do any medieval or Shakespearean research because I had to teach and supervise the writing of the curriculum.
Sure.
And so, but that was fine. And it did help the department because we had a lot of money from various sources at the time, and so we were able to support graduate students. And I had a lot of graduate students at that time, and schools around the country were interested in hiring our graduate students because they knew they'd had experience in working with curriculum as well as with working with Shakespeare and various other native people. So we placed our students fairly easily for a number of years.
So then the Great Plains project, how did that come about?
Well, that was kind of accidental. And by the way, the Great Plains Center is now 50 years old.
Yeah, yep.
And so I didn't go.
This year?
This year, yeah. They just had their 50th anniversary annual conference. And I went to that. I couldn't walk very well, and I don't have much energy, as you can see. But I went to a couple of sessions, and they were good sessions. What happened was that I had included some Native American literature in the curriculum.
Okay.
And I had begun to, the Indian people in Nebraska were in terrible shape in the 50s. They were living, Bob Crosby, who was the mayor, the governor once in the 50s and once in the 60s, had commissioned a study of Native American situation in Nebraska. And Native Americans were starving and living in terrible poverty. And the Pawnee. And then I published quite a bit of stuff on Lakota myth, creation myth, and its relationship to Black Elk Speaks. That's probably my best essay on Indian stuff, is an essay that I wrote on Black Elk Speaks. So I had some experience with working on Great Plains materials, but I wasn't a Great Plains scholar, obviously. I hadn't written any Great Plains history but Max Larson knew that I could run a program, and I was just finishing with my federal commission, which was I think a $3.5 million grant. And he said, well, said one day I met in the hall, he said, how'd you like to head a Center for Great Plains Studies? And I said, well, I don't know. I have to think about it. I'll come back and tell you. So I thought about it for a while. And I went back and said, well, yeah, if you set it up as a faculty Center for Great Plains Studies, it won't be dominated by the administration. I want all the decisions to be made by a faculty committee and an interdisciplinary, interdepartmental committee that includes scientists and social scientists and people in the humanities. So I got together a very good committee. I don't know if you know any of these people, but Francis Haskins from the Ag College was on the committee, and some geologists, and Warren Caldwell from the anthropology department, and I got some grasslands ecologists, like I can't remember his name now, Cy Harrison, I think, and then Fred Bluke was on the committee, and Brian Blue, and I told Max that he had to be on the committee, but he couldn't dominate it. He couldn't overrule any of the committee's decisions unless they were against the law. Well, that worked pretty well. And they still have that committee. They still make those decisions for the center. Oh. And I think that's partly why it's grown, because they've made good decisions. They've had good discussions of what they should do, and the director has taken his cues from the committee. There was one time when I met with Donald Jackson, who was the editor of the George Washington papers, and he came to the University of Nebraska to see what we were doing in the center, and he met with Steve Cox, and Steve called me and said, do you want to meet with Donald Jackson? Well, I didn't know much about him. I knew that he was famous, but I didn't know anything about him. But his proposal was that we edit the Lewis and Clark papers. So I said, well, I can't make that decision because the board has to make it, but I'll take it to the board. So I took it to the board, and I recommended that we do it because that was a huge grant, as you probably know, the Lewis and Clark papers. And it would become a huge grant. I said, if we hire someone to do the Lewis and Clark papers, and we don't get the grant, we'll spend all the money that we got for the center. But it'd be worth it to do something big or fail trying than to do something trivial and succeed. And, so we decided to go for it, and they hired Gary Moulton, and he wasn't the person that we interviewed that I particularly favored, but I didn't know the Wilson Clark stuff, and the board made the decision that he was the right one, and he turned out to be excellent. So that's.
He also won an ORCA.
Yeah, he won an ORCA, and he was a good editor and a good teacher and a good scholar. So I was proud of that. And we had about by the time I left the center, we had about 20 grants, various kinds. For some of them were grants that I'm proud of, like Paul Schock. I don't know if you knew Paul Schock. Paul Schock was a Icelandic scholar in the German department. He retired about 20 years ago, and he had come here to study German dialects in Nebraska, and his chair of his department said he couldn't do that. He had to do Icelandic, so he got himself rigged up as an Icelandic scholar and became a good one. But he still wanted to do this stuff on Nebraska German dialects. And so I got him a grant. I wrote to the Nebraska Committee for the Humanities, and some other people got him. It wasn't a big grant, but he put together a book out of it. And there were a lot of smaller things like that we did that covered the waterfront between the sciences and the social sciences and the humanities. I was particularly pleased. Ours was the only regional center that had scientists on the board and tried to develop a science program. It's not as good as it should be. It's not as robust as it should be. But we still have some scientists on the board, and Francis Haskins did an excellent job of supporting that aspect of what we were doing and finding money. One of the reasons that the science part of what we do is not as robust as it should be is that other places like the Water for Food Center and places like that are doing a lot of interdisciplinary work in the sciences on the Great Plains.
And that came in the 80s, right? The Water for Food? Or was it even later than that?
I thought it came later than that.
Okay, 90s.
I think it came maybe in the 90s or the first decade of the 20s. They didn't, when I was a director from 76 to 79, 50 years ago, they certainly didn't exist then. And there were, I worked with Bert Schultz and his friend, who was the geologist, who knew Margaret Mead, who was a friend of his in the geology department. I worked with them to get a conference, a very good conference on the geology of the Great Plains, and another one on the grasslands ecology in the Great Plains. So we've done some.
Okay, so let's move on to another question. Tell us about one or two of your early graduate students and what did they do and what happened to them?
Yeah, well, my first graduate student, I had graduate students very early in my career. I think I came in 57. I think by 59 I had graduate students. And my earliest graduate students were Vern Torzon, who went to the University of New Orleans and became a Spencer Scholar. Doris Meyer, who became a professor of medieval studies at the University of Northern Colorado. David Brumble, who became I think a full professor at University of Pittsburgh. He was a medievalist and Renaissance scholar. He's published in both areas. Anthony Woke, who was a Spencer and Dante scholar who taught at Portland State University and just died. They were mostly medieval and Renaissance scholars in my first years, and then after that, after I got money for education, there were quite a few people who were specialists in education also, although some of these people, like Tony Woke and David Brumble, did work in education also.
Okay.
But several of the people who wanted to do work in education, I recommended that they work with someone in Teachers College for the degree, even though I would be on their committee. I recommended that they work with Dudley Bailey, who worked with freshman English and had a reputation there, and it would be better for them, even though I might be the de facto supervisor. I wasn't the supervisor in name. But I had a lot of really good students that had, a lot of them had the state university colleges were becoming state universities in the 50s and 60s and early 70s. And a lot of my students got positions in medieval and Renaissance studies at those places. I don't know. One of my students got fired at St. Olaf. I never did know why she got fired. She was probably the brightest graduate student I ever had.
Oh, wow.
And her research as a graduate student is still cited everywhere.
Oh, wow.
But maybe she smoked pot with some students, or she was kind of a new age type student.
Okay, so it's been a long time since you've been in academia, but how does your field define impact? So how do you know when you're hiring somebody or you're evaluating someone's output that they've actually had an impact?
Well,
or that they're going to have an impact?
Well, I don't know that we do know. I mean, we try to get scholars that are doing primary research rather than just rehashing old stuff. We try to hire people who've been productive in graduate school. The English department usually hires people that are not already from another place. We try to hire beginning people, and we've had pretty good luck with that. We try to make certain that they're good teachers.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, for W. Bailey and for a succession of chairs after that, I don't know if it's still true, that the capacity to be a good teacher was far more important than in the research productivity. But we had very productive scholars in our department, and I think we tried to look at the research to see if it was original and use primary resources. I imagine you do that in chemistry also.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It's got to be doing. Yeah.
We don't try to assess whether the person is working in a fashionable field. We in fact we avoid that. We try. I mean, I worked under a mentor at Princeton who was extremely unfashionable when I came here. He then later became probably the most influential medievalist in the world. But it took a while before people understood how important he was. And a lot of people wrote essays bashing his work when I was working with him. When I took him on as my mentor, he was an untenured assistant professor, but I knew he was good. And he got tenure the same year that I chose him for my advisor, the chief advisor. So I would say you do what any intellectual does. You try to look at the quality of the work, at the logic of the work, without consulting the winds, which way the winds are blowing.
So which of your creative works do you remember the most, and why is it memorable?
Which of my creative works do I remember the most?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know that I...
Yeah, which one do you think about the most? Yeah, the most.
I don't think about any of them. I'm working on scholarship now, and
I
think about it.
Okay.
But I suppose the work, I mentioned it, the work I did on Chaucer, on Shakespeare's comedies, and on Native American literature.
Okay.
I suppose my work on Native American literature is the most original in some ways, in that nobody was doing work on that at the time I started. But I discovered I worked a lot on religious and moral values in literature, and iconology in literature, and Native American literature can be analyzed from that perspective with great great productivity and with good results. And you can see how they use their literature in their chants and in their healing ceremonies and the like, so that you can go from your assumptions about what literature does to watching the way in which they use the literature in their culture. I should brag a little bit now. I've been bragging all along, but I'll brag a little bit. I had a Navajo student who was a poet, and she wrote a book of poetry for her dissertation. And then she took a job at the University of Arizona State University at Phoenix.
Mm-hmm.
And then she was appointed to the poet laureate of the Navajo tribe a few years ago.
Oh, wow.
And just recently she's been appointed poet laureate of the state of Arizona.
Oh, wow.
And I encouraged her to write poetry both in English and Navajo, and she did that, and so that's worked out well for her.
Mm-hmm.
And she's had a good career and enjoyed life there. The reservations had a terrible drought this year, so it's been hard on her people, and she spends a lot of time with those people. But that's
Okay, so you had a lot of students. How about editorial activities?
yeah. Well,
Society leadership?
I read for some journals, but read articles for journals. I didn't have time to do a lot of that. I read books for the University of Nebraska Press.
Oh, okay.
And I edited a series called the Regents Critics Series, which has about 20 volumes in it, of writers who were important writers, but also important critics, and their criticism had never been collected before, so I had to get editors. I was a general editor, and I had to get editors for that. And that lasted for maybe till I was too busy with other things to be able to do it anymore. So.
No, that sounds good. Yeah, we talked about research funding, but give us the names of the organizations and then how it changed over the time of your career.
Well, I got a lot of funding from foundations, from the Woods Foundation, especially, from the Bureau of Research of the U.S. Office of Education, from the National Endowment for the Humanities, from the Nebraska Commission on the Humanities, from the University of Nebraska, from the Guggenheim Foundation, from the Fulbright Foundation, or Fulbright Fund. There are probably others, but I think that those are the central ones, probably.
Okay. So what techniques did you use to write your books? I mean, did you have a method to how you went about writing these papers or the books?
Well, the papers, I would usually find something in a work that had not been treated before, and it was a puzzle, and I'd move out from that. Like Chaucer's Miller's Tale begins with a quote from Virgil's Aeneid, with a sly punning on Virgil's Aeneid. Well, I had to, and it also is a commentary on a previous epic poem that Chaucer had just written for the Knight's Tale. So I had to ask myself, well, what is Chaucer doing with Virgil and with Statius, and how's he playing off those two authors in a poem which is a nasty poem by a miller who's a peasant? You know, there are a lot of quandaries.
Sure.
And three of the characters are named for biblical characters or saints. Carpenter John, which is named after the Apostle John and does some of the things that John does. Absalom, who's named after the biblical Absalom, and Nicholas, who's named after Saint Nicholas. And they have quite a bit of the iconology of those figures, those saints, surrounding them, but in a comic context. So that would be a puzzle. I'd start with that sort of puzzlement, and then I'd find out how those iconographical constructs worked in the time and how Chaucer was using them, and that's how I worked on my articles. My books, I just did the same thing, but on a bigger scale. And,
well, that sounds like fun.
yeah.
In some ways, the research is cooperative and competitive. So was your genre of writing ever co-opted by someone, or did somebody produce similar results at the same time? Were you in competition?
Well, some of my students, I had a period from the mid-'60s until 1979 when I was so busy with directing research projects that involved other people and large grants that I could not publish my research, and I had lectured it out in class. A few of my students published those things. I think they did it ignorantly. I don't think they knew that I was going to publish again. And I started in 79 publishing, and that was fine. I just would say in my writing, some of this material has already been published or has already been suggested by my student, so-and-so, who was in my classes in such and such a year. And I said that to them, and they weren't bothered by it. It didn't hurt their reputations. It didn't hurt mine so far as I know. I know there may have been other things where stuff was co-opted by other authors. But I think for the most part, I don't have any sense that I was cheated. I think that their side there they were quite happy to make citations, and I have now with the Humanities Research Center and the Digital Commons, I know that there are thousands of people that are using these things, and whenever I detect something that comes from something I wrote, they're honest about it. I think people are pretty. I can imagine somebody that was in trouble for getting tenure stealing something, but I don't think that's ever happened.
So then the opposite would be, was your work ever involved in a controversy? And then how was it ever resolved?
I don't think, it was involved in controversies in the sense that some people didn't like what I wrote and really gave negative reviews of what I wrote. That's in the medieval business. That's that's just commonplace.
Sure.
But the only way I tried to resolve it was to answer the queries that they directed at my work and show that it was at least plausible, if not definitive. Okay. I think that's worked pretty well.
So great. I think you've described your activities pretty well. If you're willing, we'll go on to other career activities, which would include society activity. Which conferences did you attend regularly?
I didn't attend conferences.
Oh, you didn't?
Hardly at all.
Oh.
Because I was so busy, I didn't have time to, except for conferences. The Office of Education asked me to make a speech. And I did a few of those, and I went to the Modern Language Association a couple of times because I was on their board, on their executive board. But if you're just barely making it, I taught during all this period. I taught my regular load of classes, so I was barely keeping up. And if I knew if I had a question, I could call a scholar and ask him. I didn't need to go to the scholarly conferences. I went to maybe half a dozen in my whole career, and maybe 15 Office of Education conferences, but they weren't important.
Great. Did you have sabbaticals, and then what did you do on sabbaticals?
Very important.
Okay.
I had a Guggenheim I had a Fulbright before I did my doctorate at Princeton, and that was helpful in that it gave me some understanding of linguistics and artificial languages. And I did some research on artificial languages in the 17th century.
Wow.
And then I used that about 30 years later. I did really, in a book I wrote on education. And then I had a Guggenheim in 1962-63, and I wrote the first draft of my Chaucer book then, and I finished it in the early 80s because I wasn't able to work on it during the period when I had so much to do.
Yeah.
But I published it in the Princeton Press, and that was fine. Some people say it's too bad it wasn't published in the early 60s, but it wasn't ready to publish in the early 60s, and I didn't care whether I was a big shot or not. I just wanted to say what I had to say about Chaucer.
Yeah, yeah.
And what else?
So 3 sabbaticals?
I had several sabbaticals.
Yeah.
I had the Fulbright and the Guggenheim, and then I had a sabbatical in 1988 at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Edinburgh. It was paid for largely by Nebraska, a bit of it by the Edinburgh Institute.
Oh.
And then another one in 1993. After I'd finished with my big projects, then I could have sabbaticals.
Yeah.
Another one in 1993 at Edinburgh. Then my wife got cancer. Well, 1997. That's when my wife got cancer, and I had to come back for her surgery.
Oh.
But I continued to work and made a book out of it, even though she died 2 years afterward. And then I had my last sabbatical was around 2006, 2007, and I had it at Stratford, at the Shakespeare Institute at Stratford, and I wrote my Shakespeare book there.
Oh, wow.
So,
Well, that sounds really fun. So on to service then. We serve the department, the university, the communities nationally. What service contributions do you remember most? I suppose you've already said the Great Plains group. It sounds amazing.
Well, I was on the Research Council, and I remember that. And I remember being on the executive committee of the Mountain Language Association. Most of my service bit was I was a consultant to the U.S. Office of Education at the very top level. From 1961 to the early 80s.
Wow.
And I did a lot of consulting there. Since the Office of Education has been largely destroyed by Donald Trump, I imagine the effects of that consulting.
They're going to need to reform it later.
Yeah, they'll have to make it again. But I did some fairly important consulting there aside from the direct consulting that I did on minority education and the curriculum. I found that the National Center for Educational Statistics, which was the original Office of Education, was originally set up as the National Center for Educational Statistics in around 1865-66.
Oh, really?
And they had gotten, in that office, they'd gotten statisticians who were interested in perfect statistics rather than usable statistics. Well, the Bureau of Labor Statistics or the statistics on inflation or whatever, they're not perfectly edited. They get them out in as quickly as they can, and then they edit them sloppily, and then they edit them perfectly again. But
years later.
Yeah, a year later, the statistics of the Bureau of Center for Educational Statistics were coming out 5-6 years after. Well, education goes in grades, and sometimes there are too many teachers, sometimes too few, sometimes there are lots of students that are flunking out, and sometimes all the important statistics. Sometimes the new teacher education graduates are they're too many for the market.
Yeah,
I mean, they're just and sometimes the people who are graduating fulfill the roles in society that they're supposed to, and sometimes they're not.
they're at odds.
They're not. And those are things that the Bureau of Educational, the Center for Educational Statistics is supposed to know. Well, my commission wrote a report, and one of their chapters was on the deficiencies of the National Center for Education Statistics. And there was sufficiently drastic in its opinions and its documentation that the U.S. Office of Education gave a big grant to a consulting firm that had knowledge about how to gather statistics in agencies that had to report quickly. And they delivered a 2-volume report to the Office of Education that really reformed the Center for Educational Statistics. And, that was
very important
service work that I did that had some results.
Yeah. So then, what courses did you teach more often than others? And then what are your thoughts about those courses?
Well, originally I taught courses in Chaucer and Shakespeare and medieval romance and Dante. And I was a young graduate from PhD from Princeton. I thought I was very smart, so I lectured too much. I lectured probably 35 minutes of the period and let people discuss or led discussion for 15, 20 minutes. And later I taught Native American Black literature. I was the first one to teach those two areas. And I thought that was very important. I got out of them as soon as they hired people that had skills in those areas, but I continued teaching those courses helped me then to get some publication. And it made my life infinitely richer because I have lots of Native American, Black, and Hispanic friends. And, so I remember those. What I think about my courses was that I did too much lecturing at the beginning. I learned to have the courses largely discussion toward the end. I developed a technique for giving the students leading questions and the information that they needed on paper before the discussion occurred, and then they would write answers to those questions, and they'd have to hand in their thoughts on the questions. And I said, if you don't like the question, you can make up another one. No, that's fine, as long as they were thinking about the work.
Yeah.
And sometimes they did that. And toward the end, I had equally learned classes, but classes which were where the students generated most of the information and most of the perspectives. That probably is not possible in chemistry, but it certainly is possible in the humanities.
Does the department still teach a course on, let's say, Chaucer?
They teach a course on Chaucer, but I'm disturbed that they haven't. They've had 2 visitations from outside scholars saying that they should hire a Chaucer scholar, and they haven't. And I don't know why, because it was a very productive area. I had 70 graduate students that got PhDs from me, quite a few of them in Chaucer.
Wow. There's a lot to digest in Chaucer.
Yeah, it's a lot to digest because you have to know a lot of languages.
Yeah.
I read French and Italian and Spanish and may have known Dutch. And you have to know Middle English.
Yeah.
and you have to know the history of the late 14th century, which is pretty fraught because the king was killed. But it's endlessly rich and interesting, and I hope to get somebody.
All right, well, let's jump back in time here. Where did you grow up, and what was your childhood like?
Oh, well, I grew up in four places. I grew up in Port Wing, Wisconsin, just off Lake Superior, and in Olson, Nebraska, which is in the northern part of the state. Hamel, South Dakota, which was on the Rosebud Reservation. My father and I knew Native American people somewhat. There wasn't a lot of fraternization with Native Americans, but they did come to Hamel to buy their groceries. And they'd walk by and talk to me. I would sit in the ditch out in front of the parsonage. And then my teenage years were in Wahoo. I went to Luther Academy in Wahoo. And I was in my childhood. My father was a lay pastor in several parishes. He had stopped seeking to become a pastor because he became deaf, and he wanted to see where that went before he went on. Eventually, he gave up. And I don't remember Wausau very well, or the first time we were in Port Wing, but I remember Hamel and the Rosebud Reservation and Dust Bowl. It was, and the Dust Bowl and the drought. It was terrible.
Wow.
And the Depression. And we were desperately poor. And I remember northern Wisconsin because when we went there, there was rain, there was lake effects rain from the Lake Superior. And we farmed on a small farm, and I helped my dad with chores, milking cows and pitching hay and taking care of the chickens and the hogs and helping gather the wood for the wood stove that we had. We didn't have electricity until I was about 16 years old.
Wow.
And
that's in Wahoo.
That's when we had got electricity.
Okay.
It was in Wahoo, yeah. But in northern Wisconsin, there was no rural electricity. There was electricity in town. And, and we got our first electricity in a house, I think in 1949, which was in Wahoo. My parents moved a house in from the meat ordnance plant. I should say that my childhood was extremely impoverished. But my parents were I had 4 children, sisters and brothers that died, and my parents took very good care of me. And they thought I was bright, and they were bright, and they just didn't have money.
Yeah.
And so they educated me well, and they saw too that I got a good education.
So when did you develop an interest in early English literature?
Well, that largely came at Princeton. I didn't expect to be a 17th century scholar and to work on artificial languages. But I found when I got to Princeton that the man with whom I corresponded about doing that was extremely bright, but a terrible drunk. And somewhat erratic. And not a good teacher anymore. And at the same time, this Robertson man was an extraordinarily good teacher. He spent a lot of time with his graduate students. It was very demanding, which I appreciated. My first course with him, he asked me to make a report on a Provençal romance. And I said, but Mr. Robertson, I don't read Provençal. I read French, but I don't read Provençal. He said, well, you can learn it well enough to get through it by 4 weeks from now. And that was the kind of thing he did all the time. He made outrageous demands on how you learned how to meet the demands.
Yeah. Well, let's jump back just a little here. Where did you go to undergraduate?
I went to Bethany. Well, I went to Luther College in Wahoo for the first. I stayed at home because my parents didn't have any money. The first year and a half, and then to Bethany College in Lindsborg, Kansas.
Oh, okay.
And
okay.
That was a very college that had very little money and was down in the dumps.
Did your father go there?
No. But my parents had attended the first year of Luther College in Wahoo.
Oh, okay.
That's where they had met. They were from Shickley and Wausau, but they had attended there.
Okay.
And Luther College was a feeder college for Bethany College.
Oh, I see.
So I had Lutheran education until I went to graduate school here at the university in 1951 to 53.
So at Bethany, what was your major then, or your emphasis? It was English. Okay.
Yeah, and I had come up here one summer and taken a course with Stepanek, and he said, "Well, you're very smart. You ought to come take a master's degree here, and we'll get you a good place somewhere else to get your PhD." So I did that and read papers for him.
Oh, okay.
Well, he was a wonderful man. I don't know if you've heard of him.
No.
Well, he never did take his PhD, but he fought. When he was at Harvard taking his PhD, he decided that Eastern Europe was in trouble. This was during and after the First World War, and so he fought with the Hungarians army, with the Hungarians and Czechs against the Magyar Hungarians who were communists. And then he took a trip around the world, and then he came back, and he wanted to get married, so he married Olga, his wife, and he taught comparative literature here. He could read French, German, and almost all the Western European languages.
Wow.
Robert Noll has an account of him in his biography.
Okay.
Anyway, he got me interested in literature. I had taken a major in English at my undergraduate college, and I almost a major in art, so I could have gone on to graduate school in art, and almost a major in chemistry.
Oh.
But I had a terrible teacher in chemistry, and I decided against that. I'm sure if I'd had a good teacher in chemistry, I had good teachers at Luther, but not at Bethany.
Oh. So then how did you choose Princeton, or how was that?
Oh, I got my Fulbright, and then
right.
And Robert Noll had just come to the English department, and he thought I was good, and he said, "Well, you should apply at Princeton." Well, normally when I advise students to apply for graduate school, I'd advise them to apply to 10 places to get at least one of them.
That's right.
But I only applied to Princeton. They gave me a full ride.
Oh, wow.
So I wasn't ready for Princeton because most of the others had attended Amherst and Dartmouth and Harvard, the very classic places, and they'd attended prep schools before that. They were really rich kids.
Right.
They had learned everything that they needed to know, and I was good at analyzing, but I hadn't read all the novels in English, and I had to read like crazy and learn languages like crazy to cope. But I guess they thought that poor bastard from Nebraska, he's so helpless, we ought to get him through.
Let me think now. So then, what was the first thing you published?
Well, I think the first thing I published was that article on Midsummer Night's Dream.
Oh, okay. Wow.
That was
nice.
Otherwise, it was an article that I wrote on the Provençal romance. And I wrote that about the same time, and I published it about the same time. It doesn't have anything like the cachet that the Midsummer Night's Dream article has. But I'm very proud of it. Very few people read Provençal, so it doesn't have a lot of people going for it. But I thought I did some good historical research there, and It's still being read quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. So in retrospect then, how far did your academic work at UNL diverge from your graduate training?
Oh, a lot. You can tell that. I taught lots of courses in education and literary education, and I had commission on education.
Mm-hmm.
I worked with schools. I taught courses in Indian.
Is that a cat?
My cat must be in there. And I think I taught 17 different courses in the English department. I had to do the research to get those courses ready.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them were courses in minority literatures or courses in areas that needed to be taught.
Mm-hmm.
And I just got them up.
Mm-hmm.
And the courses in education. And then I taught some courses in areas that were adjacent to Shakespeare. Like I taught a course in Spenser and Milton, because that's from essentially the Shakespearean period. I can use my ecological expertise to teach that. Things like that.
Nope, great. So then let's go to the personal part. Tell us about your family. You said you've had 2 wives, but children, and how do they fit into the whole timeline here?
My first wife I met at Bethany. And she was a musician and a school teacher, and she was a wonderful woman. She was the head of Nebraska for Peace for many years. And she also, as many wives did in those days, I had grants, but they only supported me, and the 2 of us would not have gotten through graduate school without her teaching and being a headmistress. She was a headmistress at a school at Princeton for a while. And she was very active in Nebraska for Peace, not only as a head for 10 years, but as a board member for another probably 15 years.
Wow.
And then she was also very active in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America and in their social theory, social committee. And she was diagnosed with cancer in 1997 and died in 1999, just before the end of the year. And about 3 years later, I married Frances Reiner, who had been an elementary school teacher, whom I had thought was a good teacher. And she lived till 2013, but she contracted Alzheimer's. So the last 3 years, we had about 8 to 10 years of good marriage, but after that she was psychotic. So that was hard. I have 3 children. And one is a mathematical economist at the University of Maryland, and right now he's working on water resources. And he takes data sets and analyzes them using optimization theory. Now, he worked on climate change and also on fisheries, fishery depletion in various parts of the world. My second child is Andrew. My first child is named Lars. My second child is named Andrew. And he's a professor at the University of Birmingham in the Department of Psychology. And he married an Italian wife. And I should say, go back, my first son has one daughter, and she's working on a PhD in computer assistance of the blind.
Oh.
My second child, Andrew, has 3 children. I should talk about his career first. He is a neuropsychologist. He was first working on aspects of how the brain produces language. And then he took his PhD at Johns Hopkins. Lars took his at Cornell.
Mm.
And he went to England because there was a department head there who used the same methodologies he used, which was helpful. And his wife is Italian, so they spend quite a bit of time in Italy.
Mm.
And his 3 children, one of them is a nuclear engineer, shutting down nuclear plants. The second one is a medical doctor, and the third one just got her PhD in biochemistry and the configuration of certain parts of the DNA that are shielded, that are under
Okay.
shield. You probably know.
Yeah, I do. Epigenetics
Well, I don't
or
know.
methylation or
I'm not sure what it's called, but that's what it is. And, she's taking her PhD at the University of Edinburgh.
okay. Wow.
And the kids are good kids. And my third child is my daughter Ingrid, and she was a physician's assistant, and then decided to stop being that until her son was grown.
Mm.
And she may be too old to go back to PA now, but she took her degree at a place in Chicago, and she has one son, and she's married to a man who was on worked with recycling wood in a factory in Goshen, Indiana, and then worked for the Ag College when they moved here.
Mm.
When my second wife died, when they moved here, I think they said because they thought Lincoln schools were better, but I think it was because they wanted to see that the old man was okay. So that's my children. I've had a wonderful family life. I've had a great social life. I've had a lot of tremendous friends in the university.
Mm.
And my family, we had a large house on A Street, 26, at the corner of 26th and A. And we had a lot of sessions there where we would read papers, college papers, and discuss the papers. I haven't done that here. I guess this room is big enough, so I couldn't
Oh yeah.
kind of. And that's the way that room was configured also. It had a circle, so it had about 20.
Beautiful room. Love your floors.
Yeah, I love them too. Yeah, that was Jim. That was our physicist.
Oh yeah.
Laid those floors himself. He found out the slate was cheap at that time.
Mm. So then, before retirement, or maybe since then, what did you do for relaxation or entertainment? It sounds like you were a work kind of guy.
Well, no, partly I don't need relaxation because I enjoy what I'm doing, and I don't ever get very tense. Sometimes when the Office of Education had big things up for grabs, I'd get tense. But for the most part, I'm not tense. But I fish a lot with my kids. And I like sports. I watch sports way too much now. And I watch, I like good movies. I like Swedish movies. I'm a Swede. I spent quite a few times going to Sweden. I like Bergman. I like some other Swedish and Danish filmmakers.
So Paul Olson sounds like a Swedish name.
It's Swedish. It's not only Swedish, but it's Skåning. And if you watch the national championship game, Michigan had a player named Cadeau, which means gift, and he's a mixture of Haitian and Skåning. His mother is Skåne, which is my province in Sweden.
Oh, wow.
And his father was Haitian.
Mm.
And he was the most valuable player in the finals.
Uh-huh. And your children have Swedish names.
Yeah, our people came from Sweden. They came, after the Homestead Act was passed. My wife's people in 1869 they farmed on a homestead. My people in the 1880s and 90s, and they farmed on farms that were not homesteads, but which were marginal farms that they could pick up without too much money.
Mm-hmm. And so your grandfather then was the immigrant?
My grandfather migrated first up to near West Point, Nebraska.
Oh, okay.
Had a farm.
Okay.
And then my grandmother thought it was too far from a church, so they moved up to Wausau where there was a church.
I see.
Wausau was only founded around in the 1890s, 1900.
Oh.
I don't know if you've ever seen Bruce Nichols' History of Nebraska, but the central folder is Wausau, Nebraska, in 1900, with Main Street has
really?
Has ruts in it. There's no ruts in it this deep.
Oh, wow. Well, I think West Point must be bigger than Wausau today.
West Point is probably a couple thousand people.
Yeah.
Probably 300-400.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much for talking to me today. I've enjoyed hearing all your stories.